Did you know that Sonic the Hedgehog has a small subset of dedicated fans that violate various copyright laws in order to create their own content based around the Sonic the Hedgehog lore and universe? If you've spent any amount of time online, you're bound to have run into one of these. Just Google your name and then the Hedgehog. Go ahead, I'll wait. Stretching back almost 2 decades, Sonic the Hedgehog fans have been creating their own characters and works of fan art out of love and appreciation for the series. Unfortunately, over the years, a lot of that fan art has become the subject of ridicule. Sonic Chew comes to mind. But believe it or not, there might actually be a greater significance to this bizarre niche than poor character design, dumb names, and cringy memes. I think that regardless of how cringy you may or may not find the Sonic fandom, the impact they've had on online culture, and the Sonic franchise as a whole, really can't be denied. So get ready to live and learn, Sonic fans, because today, we're talking about Sprite Comics. The Sonic fandom is massive, enough to the point that internet outrage alone was enough to get a $90 million movie delayed 6 months, costing the production millions of dollars to redesign the character from the ground up. Sonic fans are finicky and passionate. They've been screwed over by Sega too many times in the past. Enough to the point that some of the more overzealous artists among them have decided to take the fate of Sonic into their own hands. Because who knows Sonic better than Sonic fans, right? Some of the creators of these works have even gone on to create official Sonic games and even franchises of their own. Stuff like Freedom Planet and Sonic Mania. And there's no way that the character creation aspect of Sonic Forces wasn't inspired in some way by the Sonic fandom at large. The fan artists of the community and Sonic team seem to have a sort of chicken and egg relationship when it comes to inspiring one another. And I'd be lying if I said that Sprite Comics and Sonic the Hedgehog weren't a huge influence on me back when I was a kid. I grew up in the heyday of Sprite Comics, and I even created some for a little while. And that's why I wanted to talk about them for a bit. They're kind of a dying art form, and I wanted to shine a small light on it while I still can. Before Sprite Comics saw a surge in popularity, webcomics based around video games in general did. Comics like Penny Arcade, VG Cats, and Control-Alt-Delete were all the rage in the early 2000s, and with the popularity of video game webcomics came a growing interest in hobbies like sprite art, and it wasn't long before people realized that by using these pre-existing sprites from video games, that they could create comics and artwork quicker and easier than ever. And that's exactly what they did. In 1998, the first Sprite comic ever began. Neglected Mario characters. And while the comic definitely wasn't the best, it would go on to inspire other more noteworthy Sprite comics later on down the road. Comics like Bob and George. Bob and George served as the base that a lot of Sprite comics would steal and mimic ideas from, with many of the common tropes of the medium starting here. Stuff like having original characters that were recolors of pre-existing characters from the games, with personalities that were sometimes self-inserts of the authors. Other popular early Sprite comics included stuff like 8-Bit Theater, Kid Rad, and MS Paint masterpieces, but we're going to shift focus from the genre as a whole to 2 specific Sprite comics instead. InSonicNia and Sonic and Pals. And the reason I picked these 2 specifically is that the 2 couldn't be more opposite. Sonic and Pals was filled with wholesome family fun, and sometimes had some heavy-handed religious messages thrown in for good measure. These comics serve as great mediums for self-expression, and his religion just happened to be what this guy wanted to express. I may not necessarily agree with all the messages that were in the comic, but I think the author had pure intentions, and I can appreciate that nonetheless. But on the other side of freedom of expression, you had InSonicNia, which was the polar opposite of Sonic and Pals. InSonicNia was a crude, vulgar, and immature piece of fanfiction, with goals that were more similar to Beavis and Butthead than VeggieTales or Leave It to Beaver. A new strip of Sonic and Pals came out every day, and InSonicNia came out very rarely, with sometimes years or months passing between uploads. And where Sonic and Pals was completely appropriate for my young, dumb kid brain, InSonicNia completely wasn't. And it's that contrast between them that I think is still really definitive of exactly how large and diverse the Sonic fandom was and still is. People in the Sonic fandom express themselves in so many unique ways that it's resulted in tons of sub-niches, all spawning from the one thing these folks have in common: a love for Sonic the Hedgehog. Okay, what I'm getting at is that in the same way that Legos let kids create their own worlds and stories with familiar characters in them, Sprite comics, OCs, and fan art all serve the same purpose. They're vehicles that let people express new ideas and stories using familiar characters as a crutch to do so. Everyone has the same toys, but they all play with them differently. At least that's how it was when I was doing it anyway. If it wasn't for me discovering a website called Mystical Forest Zone while looking up Sonic websites, I might have never gotten into Photoshop, graphic design, editing, or art in general. I really think that Sprite Comics were the catalyst that led to me becoming a creative individual. So, for what it's worth, if you think this video is cringy, then don't worry. I agree, it definitely is. But that cringe is part of what made me who I am today.
You merely adopted?
Cringe.
I was born
Cringe.
molded by
Cringe.
Back when I started making Sprite Comics, around 2007, the main place to find sprite sheets of Sonic characters was the Mystical Forest Zone. The Mystical Forest Zone had been a Sonic fan site that hosted several comics, a forum, and had thousands of sprites based on different Sonic characters, including some custom sprites for characters who might not have ever even been in the games, like Sally, Bunny, or whatever that thing is. If you happen to be working on a Sonic Sprite comic in the mid-2000s, then this was the place to be. And it was also home to one of the most popular Sonic webcomics of all time, InSonicNia. InSonicNia was easily one of the most popular comics of the era. So much so, that posts about it on Sonic subreddits and forums are still common. The humor is crude and sometimes comes across as a bit dated, but I find that kind of charming, in a sort of Newgrounds Viva La Bam kind of way. This comic just had so much care and effort put into it, with details like the date and title of the comic featured in the image, giving the comic a more professional, newspaper strip style feel to it. InSonicNia used backgrounds from games like Earthbound to portray the everyday lives of characters like Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles. Over time, the comic would slowly open up and introduce other characters from the game series, as well as the greater Sonic multiverse at large. InSonicNia even featured a few animated episodes, usually celebrating stuff like milestone issues and holidays. And even though the original sites are down, fan archives of InSonicNia and the Mystical Forest Zone are in no short supply. In addition to combining sprite art from multiple games and characters from multiple eras and universes of the Sonic lore, InSonicNia also used a lot of custom, fan-made sprites, many of which were made by the owners of the website or members of the Mystical Forest Zone forum. The Mystical Forest Zone and InSonicNia were created and maintained by two brothers, Damien and Kaijin. The site was named after a made-up secret level that a friend had told Kaijin about as a kid, and InSonicNia was born out of a frustration with sprite comics from that era. Typically, a fan character would be the focus of the comic, and Sonic's own core cast of characters would be pushed to the side to focus on the main OC of the comic. But from the very beginning, InSonicNia begged to differ, choosing instead to exclusively focus on Sonic's main cast of characters. Ideas for issues of InSonicNia would be formed between Kaijin and Damien on walks home from school, with them scripting and editing the comic as soon as they got home. At the time, most sprite comics were made by kids and preteens using MS Paint, but Kaijin was just a little bit older, and by using Photoshop, he had access to effects and tools that others didn't, giving him the ability to create a sprite comic that stood out from the crowd and looked really professional comparatively. The love and dedication these two brothers had for InSonicNia and the Mystical Forest Zone radiates throughout their body of work. From its very first issue, InSonicNia promised to be everything every other sprite comic wasn't, and that's one of the things that makes it most memorable to me. The comic is insanely witty. When I went back to reread it, the majority of the Clown Emerald arc still had me cracking up laughing. From my understanding, Kaijin focused on writing InSonicNia and coding the site, while Damien focused on making sprites and the design side of things. Developing the site ended up teaching the brothers skills like coding and web design, as well as programs like Photoshop, skills that would prove useful and fruitful to their future careers as the years went on. Unfortunately though, as the brothers grew older, eventually they found themselves living in different parts of the country, and they just couldn't collaborate the way they once had. InSonicNia and the Mystical Forest Zone were a joint creative effort between the two brothers, and without them both, the comic just wouldn't have been the same. So unfortunately, the comic ended midway through its final story arc. But for former InSonicNia fans, fret not, because I've got something very special.
Right here, that's a little I used to work on early music videos, all that shit. You know?
I started this shit.
Show me fucking high.
So I did this. So it fucks me. That's how it scares the shit out of him. Look at that.
When I contacted the brothers to see what life was like post-MFZ, Kaijin actually told me how the final arc of InSonicNia would have gone, and he even sent me a copy of the unreleased final InSonicNia page. So if you're interested in that, pause the video now or check out the links in the description. In the end, there was no tragic downfall or no big breakup. The Mystical Forest Zone just ended because the brothers couldn't work together the way they once had, and without one or the other, the site would have been a shell of its former self. Which is really sad, but honestly it makes sense. By the time the Mystical Forest Zone shut down, most of the work had been shared to Spriter's Resource, and with many members of the Mystical Forest Zone community already on that site in the forum, the brothers saw no reason to keep the site going, so it only made sense to take a Seinfeld and bow out on top. And while some of the sprites from Mystical Forest Zone can still be found on the Spriter's Resource, the original site can still be visited by using the Wayback Machine, and fan archives of InSonicNia can be found all over the place. Just Google it, really. Now that I think of it, Kaijin actually had one more thing to say. At one point, the site magically reappeared, with an archive of InSonicNia comics and a single ominous message. The message simply read, "The forest will bloom again." And though that hasn't happened yet, Kaijin is still hopeful. Damien accredits the work on the site and comic as really helping him hone in his digital art skills, with their current works proving their past works to be stepping stones on the path that led them to where they are today. And Kaijin is currently writing a book, with Damien working on the art and illustration for it. It'll be called Space Pirate Robin, an 1800-page space opera set in the 17th century. And since they abandoned their online personas almost a decade ago, managing to track them down was a small miracle in and of itself. But getting the chance to talk to them, and getting to have a deeper understanding of something that meant a lot to me growing up and influenced me as a kid, was a really great opportunity. So I'd like to give a very special thank you to Kaijin and Damien for taking the time to talk to me. If you would, please be sure to thank them in the comments down below. And interestingly enough, they weren't the only ones whose future careers were influenced by making Sonic Sprite Comics. Sonic & Pals was created by Trevor in January of 2004. Its primary inspiration was Bob and George, and a lot like that comic, Trevor would sometimes use Sonic characters as self-inserts, like he did with Shadow. If you wanted to know exactly what the comic was about, it might be a little bit hard to tell you. The stories were pretty varied. Sometimes the comic would straight up adapt Sonic and Mega Man games level by level, and sometimes Trevor would just say frick it and create entire runs adapting Shakespeare. Seriously, there's a reason I picked this comic to talk about. Ever found yourself wanting to study up on some Shakespeare, but you thought there just wasn't enough Sonic the Hedgehog to it? Well, you don't have to worry about that anymore, thanks to Sonic & Pals. At a point, the comic was even popular enough to get a sponsorship from Soap Shoes.
What is soaping? Soaping is like grinding on it with just your shoes on. Yeah, it's basically like Sonic the Hedgehog.
And in case you don't remember, Soap Shoes had metal inserts that let the person wearing them grind down rails like a skateboard.
Gotta stretch out, I'm gonna grind this gnarly washing machine. Get this on camera? Textbook. Clip it.
Sonic Adventure 2 had featured Sonic wearing these shoes and had advertisements for the company all throughout the levels. But by the heyday of Sonic & Pals, Soap Shoes had ceased production and had been sold to Heelys. But thanks to Trevor, he was able to talk Heelys into trying the line one last time, and in an attempt to bring in the Sonic the Hedgehog audience, Soap Shoes sponsored Sonic & Pals as a way to promote their new line of shoes.
Is that the only thing you can do with Soap Shoes is grind washing machines in very small benches?
And keep in mind, this was all before YouTube's rise to prominence, back when sponsorships were much more rare, especially ones on this level. But getting back on topic, the comic also featured a lot of Christian imagery and messages. But like I said earlier, these characters are like toys that you can use however you want, for whatever purpose you want. And the fact that this guy used them to talk about something that's important to him isn't that surprising when you consider the fact that other people use these characters for pretty much everything else and in much stranger ways.
Viral sensation and destructor of worlds.
Viral sensation? You mean like that cute sneezing panda?
Or all those weird pictures of me?
You can really find Sonic the Hedgehog in the oddest places sometimes. But that's okay. And I think it's interesting to see the character used in so many different ways by so many different people.
Studios should stop recycling the same tired old properties and make something original for once.
Superman has been written by a million different authors, and seeing what fans do with Sonic the Hedgehog is like a microcosm of that.
No, I was just searching for more of that fan fiction of yours. Ooh, Son Amy, spicy.
You get to see that the character means something different to every single person that comes across him, and I think that's pretty cool. And besides, whether I agree with him or not, I think Mr. Fayez had pure intentions. When I emailed Trevor about the comic to ask him a few questions, the reasons he decided to make and end Sonic and Pals became a lot more clear to me. Even though his comic lasted over half a decade, and even though he made over 1,000 issues of it, what he was more proud of than anything else was that he had the opportunity to talk about his religion with other people through it.
Jesus told Simon Peter to put away his sword, and Jesus submitted himself to the soldiers and to God's will.
This guy didn't want money, he didn't want notoriety, he just wanted to put a good message out into the world. He wanted to spread love and positivity the only way he knew how. And I think that's super admirable, regardless of what you believe in. And even though my contract with the guy downstairs might be a conflicting interest with Trevor's beliefs, I can still appreciate what he was trying to do, whether I agree with him or not. Because after all, we don't always have to agree with each other on everything to appreciate each other's intentions. But the integrity of this guy doesn't stop there, because unlike most Sprite comics, Sonic and Pals actually had an ending to it. The comic lasted from 2004 to 2011, and over the 7 years the comic was running, Trevor had met the love of his life, gotten married, and managed to find a full-time job, which meant there just wasn't enough time to keep up with the comic anymore. And while most people give up and disappear, or go away on hiatus and never come back, like I did with my old Sprite comic, instead, Trevor saw things through to the end, and gave his world, characters, and story a conclusive ending, which is super rare for these types of comics. Eventually, Trevor and his wife ended up moving out to the countryside, and they began a family. And in an extension of the skills that he learned and utilized to build the Sonic and Pals website, Trevor now works as a software engineer, and spends most of his free time away from work with his family and on his farm, taking care of chickens, ducks, cats, and a dog named Sonic. One of the things that Trevor's looking forward to the most is sharing his comic with his son when his son is old enough to read it, which seems to be a fitting bookend to the saga of Sonic Sprite Comics for now. While sprite art continues to be popular across other mediums like animation and indie games, the genre of sprite comics continues to grow more and more quiet as time goes on. But when I see something like Community's video game episode, or a game like Freedom Planet, I just can't help but imagine that someone involved in one of these projects, or in projects like them, has to have gotten their start with a Sonic Sprite comic or something like it, right? Anyway, thanks for watching everyone. I'd like to give a very special shout out to some of the folks I used to make Sprite comics with, as well as the creators mentioned in this video. None of this would have been possible without you. And as always, this video was brought to you by my lovely supporters at patreon.com. So with all that being said, I've been Swim Team Captain 7, signing off.